Edward, a blind and reclusive millionaire, is about to marry Sophia, a humble young woman who has won his heart through a charity program. Everything looks perfect until fate decides to play a trick that no one could see coming. The big day has arrived. The hall is decorated with white flowers. Sunlight pours in through the stained glass windows, and the guests are waiting anxiously. Edward, in his impeccable suit, stands at the altar, his heart beating fast. He can't see it, but he can feel the happiness in the air. Sophia, radiant in her wedding dress, walks towards him. Or so everyone thinks, but something is out of place. Sophia receives a mysterious message minutes before the ceremony. Her face changes, but she doesn't say a word. At the altar, Edward feels a chill run down his spine. Sophia's voice sounds different. Her touch is colder. He knows something isn't right, but he can't figure out what. And then, the truth begins to reveal itself. The woman next to Edward is not Sophia. It's Laura, an identical imposter, with a plan as dark as her appearance is perfect. Meanwhile, the real Sophia wakes up in a dark place, confused and desperate. What happened? Who kidnapped her? And why is Laura there? Edward is about to discover that his life has been turned upside down. And that's just the beginning. What does Laura want? Why does she look so much like Sophia? And most importantly, will Edward be able to find out the truth before it's too late? Stay with me, because this story will hold you until the very last second. Love, betrayal, revenge, and secrets that will leave your jaw dropping. And remember, not everything is what it seems. The wedding continued, but the air was no longer the same. Edward, although he couldn't see, felt a restlessness he couldn't explain. Sophia's voice at the altar was almost identical, but there was something, a coldness, a distance that he had never noticed before. He tried to ignore it, attributing everything to the nerves of the big day. After all, who doesn't look a little different on their wedding day? Meanwhile, the real Sophia woke up in a dark, damp place, confused and with her heart racing. She tried to move, but realized she was tied up. The last thing she remembered was the mysterious message on her cell phone, minutes before she entered the church. Someone had followed her, covered her mouth, and taken her away. Now she was alone, not knowing where to look or who to ask for help. Back at the wedding, Laura played her role with frightening precision. Every gesture, every word, everything was calculated. She knew that Edward was blind, but she also knew that he was extremely perceptive. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. That's why she kept her posture, smiled when necessary, and answered the guests' questions carefully. But inside, Laura was conflicted. Every look from Edward, full of trust and love, was like a stab in the conscience. Edward, for his part, began to notice small details. Sophia's perfume was different, stronger, less sweet. The way she held his hand was firmer, less affectionate. He tried to talk to her, but her answers were short, evasive. Something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore it for long. Meanwhile, Sophia was struggling to stay calm. She looked around, trying to find something that could help her escape. On the ground next to her feet was a piece of broken glass. Carefully, she began to move towards it, knowing that every second counted. She needed to get back to Edward. She needed to warn him that something terrible was happening. Laura, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of her lie. Every look from Edward, every loving word, made her question her plan. She had been sent to destroy him. But now, seeing up close who he really was, she was beginning to doubt everything. Was Edward really the monster she had imagined? Or was there more to the story than she had been led to believe? The day ended, and Edward and Sophia retired to their honeymoon suite. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. Meanwhile, Sophia finally managed to get hold of the piece of glass and began to cut the ropes that bound her. She knew she couldn't waste any more time. Something terrible was happening, and she had to stop it before it was too late. And so, night fell, bringing with it more questions than answers. Edward, Sophia, and Laura were trapped in a web of lies and secrets, each fighting for something different. But one thing was certain: the worst was yet to come. While Edward tried to understand what was happening around him, Laura found herself increasingly caught up in a whirlwind of emotions. She had been sent to destroy him, but now, living with him, she was beginning to question everything she believed in. To understand Laura, we need to go back in time, to the day that changed her life forever. 5 years ago, Laura had a simple but happy life. She and her brother, Lucas, were inseparable. Lucas was an idealistic young man, always fighting for just causes. One day, he started working for an organization that investigated the illegal practices of large corporations. That's how he discovered something about Edward, something he should never have seen. Lucas tried to expose Edward, but things didn't go as he planned. Days later, he was found dead in a supposed accident. Laura never believed this story. For her, Edward was responsible for her brother's death. She swore revenge. But how could an ordinary woman stand up to one of the most powerful men in the world? That's when Victor, Edward's rival, showed up. He knew Laura's story and offered her a chance to take revenge. Victor had planned everything. Laura would impersonate Sophia, Edward's fiancée, and destroy his life from the inside. She accepted without hesitation. After all, what else did she have to lose? Now, however, Laura was beginning to see Edward in a different light. He wasn't the monster she had imagined. He was kind, considerate, and seemed to genuinely love Sophia. His every gesture of kindness was like a stab in the heart. She wondered, am I wrong? Did Edward have nothing to do with Lucas's death? Meanwhile, Edward continued to feel that something was wrong. He decided to hire a private investigator to find out what was going on. He could no longer ignore the signs. Someone was trying to trick him, and he needed to find out who and why. Laura, for her part, began to feel more and more pressured. Victor was constantly calling her, demanding that she speed up the plan. He wanted Edward destroyed, and Laura was the key to that. But she wasn't sure she could go on any longer. Every day at Edward's side was torture, a battle between her thirst for revenge and the growing doubt about the truth. And then something happened that changed everything. Laura found an old photo in Edward's house. It was a picture of him and Lucas smiling together. She was paralyzed. How did Edward know her brother? What did that photo mean? Her mind began to spin, and she realized that maybe she didn't know the whole story. While Laura tried to process what she had discovered, Sophia, for her part, was getting closer and closer to escaping. She had managed to cut the ropes that bound her, and was now determined to find Edward. She knew that something terrible was happening, and she wouldn't rest until she discovered the truth. Laura's past was beginning to reveal itself, and with it, secrets that could change everything. Edward, Sophia, and Laura were getting closer and closer to an inevitable collision. And when past and present finally met, nothing would ever be the same again. While Laura was fighting her own demons, Sophia was far away, trapped in a dark and unknown place. But she wasn't the type to be overcome by fear. With the piece of glass she had found, she finally managed to cut the ropes that bound her. Her wrists were bruised, but the pain was the least of her problems. She needed to get out of there. She needed to get back to Edward. Sophia looked around, trying to find a way out. The place looked like an abandoned basement, with concrete walls and a strong, musty smell. The only light came from a small window high up, covered by bars. She knew she wouldn't be able to get out, but there was a door in the corner of the room. Carefully, she approached it and tried to open it. It was locked, but that wasn't something that was going to stop her. With determination, Sophia began to look for something she could use to break down the door. In a corner, she found a piece of rusty metal. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She forced the lock until, finally, the door gave way. Heart pounding, she left the basement and found herself in a dark corridor. The silence was almost deafening, but she knew she couldn't stop. As Sophia tried to find a way out, she began to think about Edward. What would he be doing now? Did he know she had disappeared? Or worse, did he think she had abandoned him? These thoughts spurred her on. She couldn't let Laura continue to deceive Edward. He deserved to know the truth. After several minutes, Sophia finally found a staircase leading upstairs. She climbed quickly, but stopped when she heard voices. Two men were talking in a nearby room. Sophia hid behind an ajar door and tried to hear what they were saying. It was then that she heard something that left her cold. "Victor will be furious if he finds out she's still alive," said one of the men. "He wants her gone for good." Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. Victor, that name was not unknown to her. He was Edward's greatest rival, someone who would do anything to see him destroyed. Now, she was beginning to understand what was going on. She hadn't been kidnapped by chance. It was all part of a bigger plan. Determined to find out more, Sophia waited until the men had left the room and then went inside. There, she found documents scattered across the table, including photos of Edward, Laura, and herself. There was also a map with a location marked on it. That was where she was, an isolated place far from the city. Sophia knew she couldn't waste any time. She took the map and some of the documents, hiding them in her clothes. These clues could be the key to unraveling everything. While Sophia was planning her escape, Edward, at home, was beginning to feel that something was very wrong. He had hired an investigator, but he couldn't just wait around. He decided to confront Sophia. He called her in for a chat, trying to keep calm, but his suspicions were growing stronger and stronger. Laura, for her part, was in an even greater internal conflict. The photo she had found of Edward and Lucas disturbed her deeply. She couldn't get the image out of her head. What did Edward have to do with her brother? And why did he keep a photo of them together? She needed answers, but she knew that every false step could ruin everything. Meanwhile, Sophia finally found a way out. She ran towards the daylight, feeling the fresh air on her face for the first time in hours. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she had to find Edward. He was in danger, and she was the only one who could warn him. But time was running out. Victor wouldn't wait forever, and Laura was getting closer and closer to making a decision that could change everything. Sophia's awakening marked the beginning of a race against time. The truth was about to come out, and no one was prepared for what would happen next. Edward couldn't ignore his feelings any longer. Something was wrong, and he knew he couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine. The woman he believed to be Sophia was acting strangely, almost as if she were playing a role. He decided to confront her, but he had to be careful. If she really wasn't Sophia, he couldn't let her suspect his intentions. "Sophia, can we talk?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Laura, who was in the bedroom organizing some clothes, stopped for a moment. She knew Edward was perceptive, but she hadn't expected him to be so direct. "Of course, Edward. What's wrong?" she replied, trying to sound natural. He moved closer, reaching out to find her hand. "You've been different ever since the wedding. It's like you're not the same person anymore." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she couldn't falter. "Edward, you know the wedding was a big step for me too. Maybe I'm just nervous, trying to adjust to it all." He hesitated for a moment, but he wasn't convinced. There was something in her voice, in the way she avoided touching on certain subjects, that made him uneasy. He decided not to press any further, but he knew he had to act. The next day, Edward called in a private investigator. He couldn't trust anyone but himself to find out the truth. Meanwhile, Laura began to feel the pressure mounting. Victor called her again, demanding that she speed up the plan. He wanted Edward to be publicly humiliated, and Laura was the centerpiece. "You're taking too long, Laura. If you don't act soon, everything could fall apart," Victor said, his voice laced with menace. Laura hung up the phone, feeling more and more trapped. She knew she couldn't go on like this. Meanwhile, Edward was receiving the first clues from the investigator. There was something strange about Sophia's past, something that didn't add up. He decided to investigate on his own, but he hadn't counted on the fact that Laura was watching his every move. In a moment of carelessness, Laura found the documents that Edward had hidden in his desk. Photos, reports, everything pointing to the possibility that he was suspicious of her. She felt a mixture of fear and anger. If he found out the truth, everything would be lost. But at the same time, Laura began to question her own motives. Edward was not the monster she had imagined. He was kind, considerate, and seemed to really love Sophia. Every day with him was torture, a battle between her thirst for revenge and her growing doubts about the truth. Meanwhile, Sophia, who had escaped from her captivity, was getting closer and closer to finding Edward. She knew she couldn't just show up. She had to be careful because Victor and his men were still looking for her. She decided to hide and try to contact Edward discreetly. Edward, for his part, began to notice small details that made him even more suspicious. One night, he heard Laura talking on the phone in a low voice. He couldn't understand everything, but he heard the name Victor being mentioned. That was enough to confirm his suspicions. Someone was manipulating his life, and he needed to find out who and why. At the end of the chapter, Edward decided to confront Laura directly. He couldn't wait any longer. Meanwhile, Sophia was only a few blocks away, trying to find a way to warn him. The confrontation between Edward and Laura was inevitable, and when it happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Laura was on the verge of a breakdown. Each day by Edward's side was a battle between her thirst for revenge and the growing doubt about her own convictions. She could no longer ignore his acts of kindness, the way he treated her with respect and affection, even without knowing who she really was. That night, while Edward slept, Laura sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. Her mind was in turmoil. She picked up the photo she had found days earlier, the one that showed Edward and Lucas together, smiling. How did they know each other? What did that image mean? She felt like she was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, holding the photo with trembling hands. Meanwhile, Edward was far from sleeping soundly. He had heard Laura get up and decided to follow her discreetly. He watched her from a distance, seeing her hold something in her hands. His curiosity piqued, but he knew he couldn't reveal himself yet. He needed to find out what she was hiding. The next day, Laura received another call from Victor. This time, He was furious. "You're losing focus, Laura. Remember what he did to your brother. You can't weaken now." The mention of Lucas was like a stab. Laura felt a wave of anger and pain, but also confusion. She knew Victor was manipulating her, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that Edward was truly guilty. She decided to investigate on her own, trying to find answers that Victor had never given her. Meanwhile, Sophia was getting closer to Edward. She had found an unexpected ally, a former employee of Victor's who had regretted his actions. He helped her reach the city where Edward was, but warned that Victor was still looking for her. "You need to be careful," he said. "Victor won't rest until he makes sure you don't interfere with his plans." Sophia knew she couldn't waste time. She managed to send an anonymous message to Edward, warning him of the danger. He received the message while he was in his office and immediately felt a chill down his spine. Someone was trying to warn him, but who? Edward decided to confront Laura again. This time, he got straight to the point. "Who are you, really? And what are you hiding from me?" Laura was paralyzed for a moment, but then replied firmly, "Edward, I am Sophia. Why are you asking me these questions?" He wasn't convinced. "I received a message today. Someone is trying to warn me about you." "What's going on, Laura?" The name Laura echoed like thunder. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. He knew. How did he know? She tried to keep her composure, but her hands were trembling. "Edward, she began, but the words wouldn't come out. That's when Edward's phone rang. It was the investigator. "Sir, I found something you need to see immediately." Edward looked at Laura, his blind eyes seeming to see directly into her soul. "This isn't over," he said before leaving to take the call. Laura was left alone, feeling more lost than ever. She knew time was running out. Victor wouldn't wait forever, and Edward was getting closer to the truth. She needed to make a decision. Continue with the revenge plan, or risk everything to discover the truth about the past. Meanwhile, Sophia finally arrived at Edward's house. She hid in the back, watching the movements. She knew she couldn't just show up. She needed to find a way to talk to Edward without being seen by Laura or any of Victor's men. Laura's internal conflict reached its peak when she found an old letter from Lucas hidden among her belongings. In the letter, he spoke about Edward as a mentor, someone who had inspired him to fight for justice. Laura felt tears stream down her face. Everything she believed was crumbling. "What have I done?" she whispered, holding the letter to her chest. By the end of the chapter, Laura decided she could no longer follow Victor's plan. She needed to discover the truth, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Sophia prepared to reveal herself to Edward, knowing that the final confrontation was getting closer. Laura's internal conflict had reached its limit, and her decisions were about to change the course of everything. Edward was sitting in his office, his fingers tracing the documents the investigator had delivered. Photos, reports, financial records. Everything pointed to a web of lies and manipulations he could never have imagined. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there, clear as day. "Laura," he murmured to himself, her name feeling like a stone in his mouth. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront her directly, but this time with evidence in hand. As he prepared to leave his office, the phone rang again. It was the investigator. "Sir, there's something more. We found records that Victor is involved in this. He hired Laura to pose as Sophia. And there's more. It seems she has a personal motive for being there." Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean by personal motive?" "She believes you are responsible for her brother Lucas's death." The name Lucas echoed in Edward's mind like thunder. He had known Lucas years ago, a young idealist who worked for a charity organization he supported. Lucas had mysteriously disappeared, and Edward had always suspected that something terrible had happened. Now, it all started to make sense. Meanwhile, Laura was in her room, holding Lucas's letter. She could no longer ignore the truth staring her in the face. Edward wasn't the monster she had imagined. He had tried to help Lucas, but something terrible had happened, and she had been manipulated by Victor into believing a lie. She decided she couldn't continue with the plan. She needed to tell Edward the truth, no matter what happened. But before she could act, Victor showed up at the house. "You're taking too long, Laura," he said, his voice laced with threats. "If you don't act soon, I'll take care of Edward myself, and you won't like what happens next." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Victor wasn't bluffing. He was capable of anything to achieve his goals. "I'll do what needs to be done," she replied, trying to stay calm. Victor looked at her suspiciously but eventually left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, Sophia finally found a way to contact Edward. She sent a message to his phone. "Edward, it's Sophia. I need to talk to you. I'm in danger. Meet me in the garden at midnight." Edward received the message and felt a mix of relief and concern. He knew he couldn't trust anyone, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that Sophia was truly in danger. At midnight, he went to the garden, expecting to find Sophia. But who he found was Laura. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." He was silent for a moment, trying to process what was happening. "Where is Sophia?" he asked, his voice firm. Laura hesitated but then replied, "She's safe, for now. But there's something you need to know." That's when Sophia appeared, stepping out of the shadows. "Edward, it's really me," she said, running towards him. Edward froze for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. Two identical women stood before him, but he knew only one of them was the real Sophia. Laura looked at Sophia, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. I didn't know what to do," she admitted. Sophia looked at Laura, her eyes filled with tears. "Why did you do this? Why did you try to destroy his life?" Laura didn't answer immediately. She knew there was no more hiding the truth. "I believed he was responsible for my brother's death. But now I don't know what to believe anymore." Edward finally broke the silence. "Laura, I didn't kill Lucas. I tried to help him. Someone betrayed him, but it wasn't me." Laura felt tears stream down her face. Everything she had believed, everything that had driven her, was a lie. That's when Victor appeared, followed by several of his men. "What a touching scene," he said with a sarcastic smile. "But unfortunately, the game is over." Edward, Sophia, and Laura found themselves surrounded, knowing the final confrontation was about to begin. The truth was starting to emerge, but the danger was closer than ever. Victor stood before them, his cold and calculating smile illuminated by the dim light of the garden. His men surrounded Edward, Sophia, and Laura, armed and ready to act. The air was thick with tension, and each second seemed to last an eternity. "Victor," Edward said, his voice firm but contained. "What do you want?" Victor laughed, a dry and humorless sound. "What I've always wanted, Edward, to see you destroyed, humiliated, and now, finally, I have everything I need to make that happen." Sophia stood beside Edward, holding his hand tightly. She knew she couldn't show fear, but her heart raced in her chest. Laura, on the other hand, was paralyzed, looking at Victor with a mix of anger and fear. "You lied to me," Laura said, her voice trembling but filled with accusation. "You made me believe that Edward was responsible for Lucas's death. but he wasn't, was he? Victor shrugged, as if the question was irrelevant. Lucas was a naive idealist. He got involved where he shouldn't have and paid the price. Edward was just convenient to blame. Laura felt a wave of anger and pain. Everything she had done, all the revenge she had planned, was based on a lie. She looked at Edward, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. Edward didn't respond immediately. He knew there was no time for guilt or apologies. They were in danger, and they needed to act. "Victor, this ends now," Edward said, his voice calm but firm. "You won't get away with this." Victor laughed again, but this time there was a spark of irritation in his eyes. "You really think you're in a position to threaten, Edward? You're surrounded, and without your sight, you can't even see the danger in front of you." That's when Sophia acted. She picked up a stone from the ground and threw it forcefully at one of Victor's men, hitting him in the face. The man fell, and chaos erupted. Edward took advantage of the distraction to move, guided by Sophia. He knew he couldn't fight, but he could protect himself. Laura, meanwhile, decided she couldn't stand still any longer. She ran towards Victor, determined to stop him once and for all. "You won't hurt them," she shouted, grabbing Victor by the arm. Victor pushed her away forcefully, making her fall to the ground. "You've always been weak, Laura, a disposable pawn in my game." Meanwhile, Sophia and Edward managed to move away slightly, but Victor's men were recovering quickly. Sophia knew they needed help, but there was no one around. That's when Laura stood up, determined. She picked up a broken piece of wood from the ground and ran towards Victor again. This time, she managed to hit him in the shoulder, making him scream in pain. "You won't win," she said, her voice filled with determination. Victor, furious, ordered his men to attack. The confrontation turned violent, with Sophia and Edward trying to protect themselves while Laura fought against Victor. In the midst of the confusion, Edward managed to find the phone that had fallen to the ground. He called the police, shouting for help. Victor realized what was happening and tried to stop him, but Laura stood in his way. "You won't hurt him," she said, holding Victor with all her strength. That's when the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. Victor looked at Laura, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll regret this," he said before ordering his men to retreat. Within minutes, Victor and his men had disappeared, leaving Edward, Sophia, and Laura alone in the garden, injured and exhausted, but alive. Laura fell to the ground, her strength finally giving out. Edward and Sophia approached her, concerned. "You saved our lives," Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to make peace with the past. And now I know the truth." Sophia held Laura's hand, feeling a connection she had never imagined possible. "We'll get through this together," she said. But even with Victor retreating, everyone knew the danger was not over. The final confrontation was approaching, and this time there would be no escape. The sound of police sirens grew closer, but Victor and his men had already disappeared into the shadows of the night. Edward, Sophia, and Laura remained in the garden, breathing deeply, trying to process what had happened. Laura sat on the ground, holding her injured arm, while Edward and Sophia exchanged looks of concern and relief. "We need to move," Edward said, his voice firm but still laced with tension. "Victor won't give up so easily. He'll be back, and we need to be prepared." Sophia agreed, helping Laura to her feet. "We have to go to a safe place. The police are on their way, but we can't rely solely on that." Laura looked at the two of them, her eyes still filled with guilt but also determination. I know where Victor might be," He has a hideout, a place where he keeps documents and plans. If we can get there, we might be able to prove everything he's done." Edward hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. "All right, but we need to be quick and careful. Victor won't give us a second chance." The three moved swiftly, entering the house to gather what they needed. Edward grabbed a cane he used to navigate, while Sophia and Laura equipped themselves with whatever they could find for protection. Laura, despite her injury, was determined to help. She knew this was her chance to redeem herself, to do something right after so long on the wrong path. Meanwhile, Victor was furious. He had lost control of the situation, and now Edward, Sophia, and Laura were free. He knew he couldn't let them expose his plans. "Find them," he shouted to his men. "No matter the cost, bring Edward to me. And kill the other two." Victor's men set out in search of the trio, while he himself began destroying documents and evidence in his hideout. He couldn't leave anything that could incriminate him. Edward, Sophia, and Laura arrived at Victor's hideout, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They hid in the shadows, watching the movements of Victor's men. "We need to get in there," Laura whispered. "If we can get the documents, we can prove everything he's done." Edward agreed, but knew it wouldn't be easy. "You know the place. What do you suggest?" Laura thought for a moment, then pointed to a side entrance. "There's a back door that Victor doesn't always lock. We can try that way." The three moved silently, avoiding the guards. When they reached the door, Laura tried to open it, but it was locked. "Let me try," Sophia said, taking a hairpin and starting to pick the lock. After a few tense moments, the door finally gave way. Inside the warehouse, it was dark and quiet. They moved carefully, trying not to make any noise. Laura guided the group to Victor's office, where she knew he kept the most important documents. That's when they heard voices. Victor was there, along with some of his men, destroying papers and files. "We can't let him destroy everything," Edward whispered. Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll distract them. You two get the documents and get out of here." Sophia tried to protest, but Edward interrupted her. "She's right. We don't have another choice." Laura gave them one last look, then stepped out of the shadows, drawing Victor's attention. "Victor!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the warehouse. Victor turned, surprised to see her. "Laura, what are you doing here?" "It's over, Victor. I won't play your dirty game anymore." Victor laughed, but there was a spark of anger in his eyes. "You really think you can stop me? You're just a disposable pawn." While Laura distracted Victor, Edward and Sophia moved quickly, gathering as many documents as they could find. They knew they didn't have much time. Laura continued to confront Victor, trying to keep him occupied. "You lied to me, Victor. Use my pain for your own ends. But that's over now." Victor, furious, ordered his men to seize her. Laura fought back, but she was outmatched. That's when Edward and Sophia appeared, throwing the documents to the ground. "It's all here, Victor," Edward said, his voice firm. "All your lies, all your crimes. The police are on their way, and this time you won't escape." Victor looked at the documents, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think this will stop me? I'm untouchable." That's when the sound of police sirens echoed outside. Victor, realizing he was cornered, tried to flee, but was quickly surrounded by the police. Laura, exhausted, fell to the ground, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Edward and Sophia approached her, helping her to her feet. "You did the right thing," Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. I just wanted to make peace with the past. And now I can. As Victor was taken away by the police, the three knew that the nightmare had finally ended. But even with Victor's threat neutralized, there were still wounds that needed healing. Laura looked at Edward and Sophia, feeling a connection she had never imagined possible. She knew there was still much to resolve, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as Edward, Sophia, and Laura emerged from the warehouse. The police had taken Victor and his men away, and the documents Edward and Sophia had managed to recover were more than enough to ensure he would never threaten them again. But despite the victory, the air was still heavy with unresolved emotions. Laura walked between Edward and Sophia, feeling the weight of her past actions. She looked at Edward, her eyes filled with remorse. Edward, I don't know how to ask for forgiveness for everything I did. I was so blinded by anger and pain that I almost destroyed your lives. Edward paused for a moment, turning to her. His expression was serious, but there was no resentment in his eyes. Laura, you did terrible things, but you also saved us. Without you, Victor would never have been exposed. I can't forget what happened, but I can understand what led you to it. Sophia, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. We've been through things we never should have, but now we have the chance to start over. Together, Laura felt tears stream down her face. She hadn't expected forgiveness, but Edward and Sophia's words touched her deeply. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Maybe not, Edward replied, his voice gentle. But everyone deserves a second chance. And you can start now. The three continued walking in silence, each reflecting on what had happened. When they reached Edward's house, he suggested that Laura stay with them for a while until she decided what to do next. You don't have to be alone, Sophia said, holding Laura's hand. We can help you rebuild your life. Laura hesitated, but then nodded in agreement. She knew she couldn't go back to the life she had before, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Days passed, and slowly life began to return to normal. Edward and Sophia worked together to rebuild what Victor had tried to destroy, while Laura started facing her own demons. She decided to volunteer at a charity organization, helping people who, like her, had been manipulated and used by others. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Edward broke the silence. Laura, there's something I need to tell you. She looked at him, concerned. What is it? He took a deep breath, as if choosing his words carefully. I found something among Victor's documents. Something about your brother, Lucas. Laura felt her heart race. What did you find? Edward hesitated, but then continued. Victor not only lied about my involvement in Lucas's death. He was responsible. Lucas discovered something Victor didn't want anyone to know, and he killed him to silence him. Laura froze, Edward's words echoing in her mind. All the anger, all the pain she had felt for years had been directed at the wrong person. She felt a mix of relief and sadness, but also gratitude for finally knowing the truth. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered. You don't need to say anything, Edward replied, his voice filled with compassion. Now you know the truth, and you can move forward. Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Edward, for everything. The chapter ends with the three of them sitting on the porch, the starry sky above them. They knew there were still challenges ahead, but they also knew that, together, they could overcome anything. And so, the story of Edward, Sophia, and Laura came to an end, but also to a new beginning. A beginning filled with hope, forgiveness, and the promise of a better future.